Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Sofia. I think it would surprise most Americans to learn that you are not in control of your body and what happens to it, nor your physician, nor your caregivers. A government agency is in control of your body and what happens to it. This literally defines fascism, despite the left's attempts to convince the public that word doesn't mean what you think it means. COVID defined regulatory capture. During COVID, physicians were disallowed from treating how they saw fit for their patients. Prescriptions were reversed. Remdesivir was prescribed by administrators, not doctors, despite the staggering death rate. Physicians were fired for prescribing treatments, then alternative treatments, and then things like IV-NAC. Physicians lost licenses for trying to save the lives of their patients. What you don't hear too much about is the nurses. The nurses who were stuck in gears, powerfully grinding them up and spitting them out. To go against orders meant losing a job or license and in public discrediting or worse. Whistleblowers were given what we now refer to as whistleblower treatment. The machinery, like all machinery, was a complex and virtually undefinable collection of subsystems, all working together as one mechanism. It included, but was not limited to, insurance, Medicare and Medicaid, hospital administrations and administrators, pharmacies, the CDC, NIH, physicians, nurses, agencies, interns, residents, attendings, hospital institutions, the Department of Homeland Security, and regulatory agencies like OSHA. The censorship in this case meant censoring the pros, and it wasn't subtle. It was shut up. And if you don't, here's the door. And if you still don't, we're coming after you. It was a total departure from previous standard of care, from the known history and medical procedure. We all know they banned ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, but for example, ibuprofen was standard of care for inflammation, yet it was banned during COVID. Who ever heard of banning Advil? They lowered the dosage of steroids to the point where it was meaningless when steroids had shown success. The use of vents was out of control, unprecedented, and had no rhyme or reason. Yet any professional who said anything was thrown out, dismissed, fired, blacklisted. When the pros said, "We are killing people," the pros were given whistleblower treatment. Of all the COVID-related atrocities, the hospitals killed the most, and the damage is ongoing, and no one has documented it comprehensively. It was literally like a horror movie or the Gulag Archipelago. Anecdotal horror stories poured in to the point where it wasn't even surprising anymore. Some patients weren't fed or given anything to drink and were locked in rooms, sometimes for days. Some died from sheer neglect. One Canada hospital locked people in their rooms for 14 days if one person tested positive. Another took patients' walkers away and locked them in rooms. Hospitals were getting bonuses to get patients on remdesivir, and another bonus if they got them on a full, complete course. And they were giving multiple courses. Remdesivir had been banned in 2019 because it was killing everybody. Yet here it was 6 months later as standard of care. When patients refused or said they didn't want it, they were lied to, told it wasn't remdesivir. Or they waited until the patient was asleep or sedated and gave it to them without their knowledge or consent. Someone would come in with an ailment, and they kept testing over and over and over until it came back positive. And we all know the problems with the PCR testing as a diagnostic. They would get patients to admit anxiety and agree to psych meds, which allowed them to admit under a 5150 hold. Psych meds depress breathing and respiratory, so now they could say that patient was a COVID risk, and then they would test repeatedly, sometimes hundreds of times in one day, until it was positive. Experimentation occurred. Worse, knowing it would be fatal. Hydroxychloroquine was issued in known fatal doses to prove it was fatal. As always, there were financial entanglements. In California and New York, the hospital got around $12,000 per COVID patient. In Tennessee, that number jumped up to $166,000, and in West Virginia, a staggering $470,000. Why? They based it on the previous year's Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. The states that had the most Medicare and Medicaid patients got the most money per COVID admission. That's racketeering. Conveniently, you can't go after a government agency under RICO. The hospitals received payments for ventilating patients, and if they kept someone on a vent longer than 96 hours, they got an additional bonus. The goal of putting someone on the vent is to get them off as soon as possible. This procedure incentivized the inverse. The longer you are on a vent, the less chance you have of survival. When someone is vented, that's 5 to 15 drug drips, for which they were also paid. In some cases, the bags were outside the rooms and changed without even looking at the patient to see if they were still alive, let alone getting better or worse. This goes against every medical protocol and procedure in place. Tube feeding was causing a diabetic problem, which was being categorized as, wait for it, COVID. Nurses have way more clinical experience than any doctor. It became crystal clear as soon as the patients were put on remdesivir that the organs started failing like crazy, and the experienced nurses knew instantly. If you hang the bag and every time the patient goes into organ failure and dies, you don't hang that bag again. But the pressure was intense. When nurses said they wouldn't do it, they were pressured and threatened, and when they spoke up, they were finally fired. These were credible, experienced people who were seeing that the protocol was failing and killing people. And when those people spoke up, they were not only overridden, but then threatened. And then even after they were fired, they continued to experience people going after them. There was a decree in some administrations that when someone spoke out, they were to look into this person. That person was then targeted. They would research where they lived and their background and family and file complaints against their licenses and issue threats. The UN supported a group called Team Halo. The Secretary General of Communications admitted it. Team Halo set about doxing and threatening and harassing nurses who spoke out about the murders in hospitals and what they were seeing from the jab. Many received death threats or strange men showing up at their doors, intimidating them. Pictures of their children with gruesome images were sent to these nurses. Several had to change their names and move, in some cases their whole family. One now drives a garbage truck. As patients, we are entitled to have an advocate. Those notices used to be everywhere in every hospital. Not only have those notices disappeared, but patients were refused advocates. COVID systematically degraded patients' rights and were replaced with dangerous protocols that were enforced, not optional. We are not course correcting. We are not mitigating. This is dangerous. We have lost our patient medical rights, and we will not be getting them back without a fight. Time magazine credits Ken McCarthy with being the person who had the fundamental insight that made it possible to turn the internet from an academic military-only tool into the mass medium we know today. In addition to being the first person to recognize the financial value of clicks, he was one of the pioneers of the banner ad, push-button audio, and many other now common commercial foundations of the internet. Early in 2020, Ken commented on the reports coming out of China and predicted the whole thing was a setup to race new vaccines to market. He's produced 4 books on the subject since then: Unraveling the COVID Con Volumes 1 and 2, The Nuremberg Code, which he re-released with Vera Sharov, and Fauci's First Fraud. The latter was based on a documentary he released by the same name in August of 2020. This film was cited 28 times in Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci. This book, What the Nurses Saw, is the only book that comprehensively covers the subject of the top-down ordered systemic medical murders that killed thousands, perhaps as many as hundreds of thousands, in hospitals in the US and around the world during the COVID panic. The book details the atrocities that took place during COVID and includes interviews with numerous veteran nurses. The question is, where is the public outcry? Where are the medical ethicists? Why is Ken having to write this book at all? Whatever darkness necessitated him putting himself in the line of fire, I am grateful that he is. Please welcome Ken McCarthy.
Wow, thank you. That's a better introduction and summary of the book than I could possibly make. You covered it all. You covered it all, but we could go into some more of the details. But
Well,
that's pretty much.
thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for putting this together as I mentioned, in a comprehensive place. You know, we've heard chirps of things, but they get shot down so quickly. It's really hard, unless there's safety in numbers, to be able to have something comprehensive that we can look at and see the big picture. One of the things that you talk about extensively is the throwing out of nurses and doctors who were experienced, who were pros. and then hiring people, in some cases, not even out of nursing school, to run ICUs, which of course is highly illegal. Hiring doctors from overseas with questionable degrees or licenses, or at the very least untrained in this country's standards and protocols. This was the norm. In New York City, the residents were running COVID units. It becomes clear that they did not want people with experience who might know what they were looking at there. That out of the gate seems to me like an upside down model. What in your research did you turn up for this book in terms of that paradigm shift?
Gotcha. The core of all this was a campaign to panic the public. It was terrorism. I mean, they didn't drop bombs on people, but they terrorized us all day long and all night long with horrifying stories. The first act was China. The second act was Italy. But the third act, and the one that really made everything go crazy, was New York City in particular, and the New York City public hospitals. And so there was that. If you remember, and it's hard, this is why I wrote the book, because our memories fade. But if you remember, New York City was the beachhead, right? That's where the virus landed in America, which is a ludicrous narrative, but that's the narrative they told us. And they called for nurses, and contract nurses came from all over the country and the world. Some problems with this. They changed the laws on the doctor side, and they allowed doctors who aren't even licensed in the United States, people that have come from other countries, to come in and work in these New York City public hospitals to deal with COVID. That is already, right away, very suspect. Second, they signed up doctors, obstetricians, podiatrists, I'm trying to think of the other specialty, to work in the IC unit. We're going to talk about the nurses in a second too. But let's realize this. Just the fact that you have an MD doesn't mean that you're qualified to engage in every single aspect of medical practice, right? I mean, if you think that's true, then go to a podiatrist for open heart surgery. That's not how it works. So bringing in doctors into the ICUs who didn't have ICU experience, immediate disaster in the making. Bringing people from overseas that aren't, frankly, up to the standards, and some of them couldn't even speak English very well, into America to practice medicine in the ICU, also not good. The nurses situation was in some ways even more amazing. They brought nurses, they allowed nurses to work in ICUs that in New York City. I don't know how it happened in every hospital in America, but we absolutely know how it went down in New York City, which was sort of the ground zero. Some nurses were brought in who had not even graduated from nursing school. They did not even have a degree. Then you had some nurses who had just graduated, but they hadn't done their practical training yet. But in any event, no one should have been in those ICU units, those intensive care units, who wasn't experienced, trained, and certified in ICU work. And those ICUs in the New York City public hospitals during COVID were overwhelmingly staffed with people that did not know what they were doing. There's a lot of specialized knowledge, a lot of specialized skills, experience, sense of what to do that you can only get through specific training and through months and months of supervised experience. These hospitals didn't have those people. Even worse, as worse, when you put somebody on a vent, and we go into this in great detail in the book, and it's really not been covered anywhere in the mass media or the alternative media. It's a very specific medical procedure, and it is extremely invasive. It's about as close to opening somebody up in surgery as you can get. You need a particular person to monitor these machines and monitor these patients. They're called respiratory therapists. They have a 4-year training. It is, and plus all the clinical supervision they get. This is a very serious profession. In these hospitals, they would have one respiratory therapist for 300 patients. You're supposed to have one respiratory therapist for 2 to 8. So this,
Wow.
so the thing, I mean, this was insane. And you might say, well, there wasn't enough money, and they were paying the contract nurses $10,000 a week. And the contractors who provided these contract workers to these hospitals, and the hospital administrators who accepted them, didn't care whether they had the proper training or not. Now, that's a recipe for death, right? I mean, that right there, we don't even have to get into all the other stuff. There's a lot of other stuff, and it's really bad. But right
It is a
there, it's a recipe.
recipe. It is a recipe for death, and it's astonishing to me that, it's not that they didn't have access to the experts, because these were the experts who were being dismissed in favor of bringing someone in who was less experienced. And, the level of heroism of some of these nurses, especially after the rollout of the vaccines. You and I have talked about this. Some of the nurses stayed and took a vaccine they didn't want in order to stay in the hospitals and save people murdered. And in some cases, that included shuffling patients out the back door to help them escape.
Yes, this is really important, and the nurses were really the heroes here. I just want to talk about another structural thing. You have a thing called residence. So you've got your MD, and now you're working in a hospital, and you're called a resident. You're supposed to be supervised because you really don't know what you're doing. You've got all the book knowledge in the world, but you can't know what you're doing. Like if I taught you how to fix a car and you'd never seen a car or worked on a car, someone's got to show you the details, right? So that's what a resident is. The residents were running the ICUs and the COVID wards during the panic in New York City in the public hospitals. And I asked some of the nurses, were they being supervised? And they said sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes the supervising physicians who were supposed to manage the residents who were calling the medical shots didn't even show up. Now, some of them did and some of them were good, but there were cases where residents were running the show. Now, you got the residents on the one hand who've got their MDs, but no clinical experience at all, no supervised clinical experience at all. And then you have veteran nurses, 10, 20, 30 years of practice. Now, everybody knows that this is true. If you think about it, if you've ever been in the hospital, you'll see your doctor for a minute. It's the nurses that see you the rest of the time. So in fact, nurses have way more clinical experience than doctors. I know doctors don't like to hear that. Some of them don't. Some of them will admit it. The ethical ones will admit it. But the nurses have a great deal of clinical experience. Occasionally, by good fortune, some skilled nurses got into these ICU units in New York City, and they did everything they could to turn things around. I mean, we have it in the book. You've seen the videos, hopefully, of Nicole Sorotek. I mean, they called Washington, they called Albany, they called civil rights groups, human rights groups, they called Division of Aging, they did everything they could. They fought the doctors, they fought the administrators.
The level of heroism definitely can't be understated. We're going to take a quick break and come back, and I have a couple of questions for you about where you think we can go from here.
The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD, 720-605-3900.
When I invented MyPillow, my passion was to help each and every one of you. And 20 years later, all of your support is what keeps us going. Because of you, we've been able to create thousands of USA jobs and help millions get the best sleep ever. To thank you, my employees and I are bringing you a limited edition MyPillow. The Giza Elegance MyPillow is made with my patented adjustable fill, the most amazing cotton, and a 2-inch pipe gusset. It has 4 custom loft levels, machine washable and dryable, and you get my 60-day money-back guarantee and 10-year warranty.
Go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get your limited edition 20th anniversary MyPillow queen size. Retails for $69.98, now only $19.98. That's right, get a queen size MyPillow for only $19.98.
From all of us here at MyPillow, thanks America!
Ken, you and I have had this conversation offline, but I know, there's a lot of these professionals, I think, who know that it was wrong, who are, at this point fairly destroyed by what they did, and I think that's not a rare phenomenon. But I think that there's also a whole lot of the dug inness. They can't even go there because they can't actually shoulder that burden. It's too much of a weight for them. Um, how do you see? Because the real danger in all of this, the atrocities were committed. That is unquestionable. But the reality is that the changes that have been made now today to our patient rights and our medical rights, the danger really is that our medical system not only failed, but is set up now to fail us in the future. So, how do you think, aside from obviously you've put together this book, which is comprehensive, how do you think we can start to get the word out to professionals in a way that is going to hopefully make them realize, okay, yes, we all made these mistakes under the pressure and inducement of all of these different forces. That's then we don't want to set up to continue this and have enforced medicine, which is the road that we're on right now. How do you see the ability to be able to talk to these professionals to prevent something like this from happening again, which it will if we don't course correct right now?
I mean, it absolutely will happen again. And I mean, what they did was they really degraded an already struggling medical system massively using COVID as a cover. And a lot of the degradations that they introduced to the hospitals are ongoing. So maybe COVID's gone, but the damage that's been done to common sense, procedures, decency is long lasting. I'm going to say something that might seem a little controversial. I know there are heroic doctors, but I don't think we can count on the doctors. Who I think we can count on are the nurses and the respiratory therapists. And the reason for this is financial. The doctors have enormous investment. We were talking previously, they start in high school preparing to get into the good college, preparing to get into the good medical school. They've got, $500,000 in medical school expenses. And they're all, and here's the other sad fact of life. They're all hired hands now. You used to have independent doctors, you used to have people that had their own practices. That is very rare now. And every doctor is really a hired hand. And they've got, they're very invested in the system, and it's very hard for them to see how corrupt it is. We have had some doctors that have come forward, and they've been heroic too. The nurses and the respiratory therapists, but particularly the nurses, because they've been the most organized, they are our best hope. And if we want to get out of this, what we need to do is, first of all, understand what happened, understand the heroism of the nurses, both during this disaster and afterwards, because they're still being harassed. They're still fighting for their licenses. I mean, you'll see it in the book. It's unreal what they've had to go through just simply to try to save people's lives in hospitals. The good news, and there is good news, is they have formed very robust organizations. You have American frontline nurses, you have Canadian frontline nurses, you have some other organizations. These groups have tens of thousands of members, of nurses, and they are doing what they can to develop an alternative medical system. On the one hand, there are people that you can, these are trained, experienced people. You can go to them with minor problems instead of having to go into the medical meat grinder, and they can help you. They can also help you if you have a loved one in a hospital who is being abused, who is being injured, or who is on the path to being killed. They can provide advice, they can provide intervention, and this is what they do. So these organizations, I'm sorry to say, physicians have not created a similar group. It's the nurses. The nurses are heroes. These are our heroes in COVID. If we're looking for heroes, it's the nurses. And that's the reason. My inspiration for the book was getting to know their stories. And we, a lot of us saw Nicole Sorotek, back in May of 2020, weeping at the catastrophe that was taking place. Unfortunately, that was a blip in our internet sphere, and it was gone. So this book brings that together. It brings the many nurses from various different parts of the country and world that experienced and saw this. We go into the details of what happened, as you pointed out in your beautiful introduction, which I really appreciate. It also goes into the infrastructure, the bureaucratic infrastructure that imposed these conditions on the doctors and nurses. But the most important thing about this book is that it shows the way out. The way out is to get to know our good nurses and our good nursing organizations that have sprouted up after this, learn about what their work is, support them, and if you need to, use them. And you'll see what they're doing for people in this book. It's unbelievable.
What I love about exposing how heroic these individuals, there's the unlikely hero and the hero who doesn't volunteer for what they're doing, they get thrown into it. But in this case, we are talking about people who are not just heroes of circumstance. They signed up for this, knowing this. We've discussed this before. Firefighters don't complain about going into a burning building. That's what they signed up for. It's not like they just accidentally happen to be there and under the pressure of the moment to happen to do the right thing. No, you know that you're signing up for a dangerous, potential, whether it's exposure, even things like tuberculosis or whatever. This is something, they're heroes going into this profession already. And then they're confronted with an anomalous situation or an extraordinary circumstance, and still are the ones standing up to be the heroes in this extraordinary circumstance, for which they also knew there was a possibility that they were going to be ending up in a situation like this. So across the board, we're really looking at people who, it's just the character that they have has put them in this point in history, hopefully, to be able to redirect, course correct, and save people's lives. So we have a couple minutes left. Tell me and tell my audience, please, where people can find you and how they can order your book.
Great. The most important thing is you don't need to find me. Get the book. Find the book and get it. It's on Amazon, and I know some people have mixed feelings about Amazon, but and Sofia, you know this better than anybody. We have to use Amazon because our local independent bookseller will not carry books like this. We experienced this when we tried to get Bobby Kennedy's book on Fauci in. I'm not going through that again. I spent dozens, maybe scores of hours trying to get that book.
We went through some stuff going there.
Yeah, and I'm not going through that again. So not a fan of Jeff Bezos. I'm a union man, and I'm not a fan of how he treats his employees. But this is what we've got. This is the tool we have. So you can go to Amazon, type in what the nurses saw, and there it is, and you can get it. And I'll say the same thing about this book that I've said about Bobby's book on Fauci. Buy more than one. Buy one for your library. Buy one for family members. Buy one for community members. This is important information. It's also life-saving information because this is not just the dark tale. Document it. It's also what can you, the reader, do about it. Not what can we do in some distant past, a future. What can we do about it right now? And these nurses are our answer. We rarely call women heroes. I don't know why that is. These are the greatest heroes that we've got in the COVID world. They don't call themselves heroes either. What you'll see from the interview, they just went to work and did what had to be done and took whatever fire they had to take, which is the real hero. That's real heroism.
Agreed. Real integrity is doing the right thing, knowing that no one's going to know whether you did it or not, right?
And punish you for doing the right thing.
Right, and against all odds. Thank you, Ken, so much for being with us, and thank you for taking the time to put this absolutely comprehensive book together to try to get the word out there so that people can start to take their own health into their own hands and to know who they can trust. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sofia. And that's exactly what